Welcome to a brand new SQL Server 2012 screencast series. My name is Artemakis Artemiou. I'm a SQL Server MVP, and in this first screencast we're going to see how we can migrate to a contained database. First, let's see what contained databases are. Contained databases are databases isolated from other databases and the SQL Server instance onto which are hosted. The majority of the metadata that describes the database is maintained within the database. The users in contained databases are no longer associated with SQL Server logins, so this simplifies the security model and of course provides portability. Authentication can be achieved by using contained user, which can either be a contained user with password or Windows principals. We can enable contained database authentication using spconfigure contained database authentication, set the value to 1, and similarly we can disable it by setting the value to 0. Of course, we can do all this using the graphical user interface provided within SQL Server Management Studio. In this screencast, we're going to see two scenarios. The first scenario is migrating a traditional database from one instance of SQL Server to another without migrating the SQL Server login that's used for accessing the database. And the second scenario is doing exactly the same thing, with the only difference that this time the database will be a contained database. And we'll see that when using the contained database, there's absolutely no problem accessing the database in both instances. So the first scenario, we are using a SQL Server login, accessing the AdventureWorks database. Everything is normal, everything works good, and then we migrate the AdventureWorks database to the second instance of SQL Server, and we don't migrate the SQL Server login, or there's something wrong with the password or any other similar issues, and we can see that the AdventureWorks database is not accessible any longer when using the SQL Server login that we used to use in the first instance of SQL Server. Then we are going to access a contained database by using a contained database user. Then we're going to migrate this database to another instance of SQL Server, and again we will see that the database is accessible, and this will be the case when migrating the contained database to any other SQL Server 2012 instance. So let's jump to the live demos. So here in Management Studio you see that this is my first instance of SQL Server. I have the AdventureWorks database. It has the AWorks user that is mapped to the AWorks login in the security tab of my SQL Server instance. The AWorks login is mapped to the AdventureWorks database as a DB owner. So this is the traditional approach of having a SQL Server login for accessing the database. So I can connect to the database by using the specific login. You see that AdventureWorks database is accessible. Excellent. Now let's back up this database and move it to the second instance of SQL Server. We'll create a copy-only backup. Okay, the backup has been created. So I will log in to the second instance of SQL Server as sysadmin in order to restore the database. Okay, first I'm going to change the location of the data and log files in order not to do any changes on the original data and log files. Okay. So you can see that the database was restored. On the security tab, we see that there is the user AWorks. Of course, this user is orphaned because we didn't migrate the SQL Server login associated to this user from the first instance of SQL Server. So in the security tab of the instance, you see that there is not such login here. And if we try to access the database on this second instance of SQL Server, we won't be able to do so because the login is not present. So in order to overcome this issue using a traditional approach, you need to migrate the login from the first instance of SQL Server to this one, or create a new login on this second instance of SQL Server and map it to the orphaned user. There is also a store procedure that you can run for fixing this problem. But for the time being, we're just going to show the benefit of using contained databases, which of course does not require to migrate the SQL Server logins associated to the user. Actually, you don't need to have a SQL Server login for accessing a contained database. You just need to have a user that exists within the context of the contained database. Let's delete AdventureWorks from this second instance of SQL Server because we are going to restore it again after converting it on the first instance to a contained database. Okay. So the first step is to enable contained database authentication on your instance of SQL Server. From the graphical user interface within SSMS, you go to properties of the instance, and on advanced, you can just enable contained databases. I had it enabled from before, so I don't need to do anything else right now. rather than converting the AdventureWorks database to a contained database. I can do this by going to the properties of the database, and in options I just select the containment type to be set to partial. In SQL Server 2012 you can, at the time being, you can set partial containment, meaning that you can have some objects outside the context of the database and some other within the context. Of course, for purposes of accessing the database, you can just have a user in the context of the contained database. And this is what we're going to do right now. So after setting the database to partial containment, okay, it seems that there is another process accessing the database, and I'm not allowed to change anything. Let's try again. Okay, the easiest way to overcome this issue is to just restart this SMS. Another way would be to go to the running processes and find which process is accessing the database. So again, we go to properties of AdventureWorks database, options, containment type set to partial, and now the first step of converting the database to contained database is achieved. You see, the containment type of AdventureWorks database is set to partial. Okay, now we need to create a user in the database, but first let's delete the old user in order not to confuse it with the new user. Okay, so I'm creating a new user for my newly converted contained database. It will be a SQL user with password. You have other options here as well. You can use a Windows user or other options. I'm creating again the AWorks login. The default schema will be DBO. And I'm setting it to be a database owner. Okay. So now, eventually, if I try to access the database using the contained user, I should be able to do so. Before entering the credentials of your contained user, you just need to go to Options and select the database to connect to, the contained database. In this case, it is the AdventureWorks 2012 database. And now I'm just using the AWorks contained user. You see, I managed to connect to the instance, and as you see here, I have access to only to the AdventureWorks database. And as a DBO, you can easily do whatever you like. Great. Okay, now let's log in again as sysadmins. back up the contained database. Just want to show you here that we don't have any any logins within the context of the SQL Server instance. We are just accessing the database using the contained user. So let's back up the database. Sorry, let's create a copy only backup again. Works 12C. Okay, our contained database is backed up. So let's connect to the second instance of SQL Server. And let's restore the database here. Again, let's change the file locations. Great. It seems that I forgot something here. Yeah, sure. Before restoring the database, as it is a contained database now, the AdventureWorks 2012, I first need to enable contained database authentication on the second instance as well. So before doing anything else, I just need to enable this setting here. So again, I go to the properties of my second SQL Server instance. I go to Advanced, and I just set this flag to true. Okay, let's try again to restore the database. Excellent. Our database is being restored. Okay. So you see that we have our AdventureWorks 2012 database on the second instance of SQL Server 2012, and here are the tables. And the security tab of this database, we have the AWorks user. Again, on this instance of SQL Server, we don't have an AWorks login. So let's disconnect and try again to connect to this second instance of SQL Server directly on the contained database. Again, we go to Options, we select the database to connect to, and use the same credentials as before. And that's it. Now imagine this portability provided by this feature, by the contained databases authentication. Imagine the benefits that can be derived out of this new security model. You can easily move databases among instances of SQL Server without having to worry about SQL Server logins, without having to worry about data applications access issues. You just need to give each time the name of the instance, and you don't need anything else, because the user will be always the same. So let's wrap up. Contained databases introduce a new security model, a more robust security model. These databases are isolated from other databases and the SQL Server instance onto which are hosted on. Users in contained databases are no longer associated with SQL Server logins. The authentication can be achieved via contained users with passwords or Windows principals. And of course you have portability, which leads to more robust data applications. These are some resources related to this screencast. Feel free to visit them for more information. And thank you very much. See you again on the next screencast of SQL Server 2012.